disadvantaged geographical location on the one hand of being landlocked also means that it has a very significant geographical position as a security space between major powers. I would call it a negative security space, by which I mean that no power would like a third power, another power to dominate this region, because that would pose a threat to the security of anyone. So, I mean, we know from Indian history how Central Asia was the place from where most of the invasions, the security threats emanated. For the Chinese too, the threats were from the marauding tribes, the Mongols and the Turks, and they built the Great Wall to protect themselves. And the Russians, they expanded into Central Asia, and for example, in the 20th century, their move into Afghanistan was dictated by their desire to protect that space, because there are no natural boundaries here. So that is the, I'd like to put that setting. As far as India is concerned, we have always had very close historical and cultural ties with this part of the world, and it has greatly influenced certainly the culture, language, habits of North India and Pakistan. Conversely, it is through Central Asia that the Indian cultural influences reached Tibet, Mongolia, China. Buddhism traveled via Central Asia. So there is this connection, and certainly in the psyche of the Indian people, the Central Asian connection is important because all the invasions came from this part of the world. This region lost its strategic importance. Nowadays there's this talk of the Great Silk Road, which the Chinese are touting and building up. But for a few centuries, this had gone. Why? Because the trading routes shifted to the seas, and the importance of Central Asia as a transit space, as a geostrategic space, declined. And then, of course, you had the Soviet Union, which took over parts of Central Asia. Let's remember that Tibet and Xinjiang were independent or semi-independent till about the middle of the last century. But then the Chinese have taken it over, and till this Cold War was on, this was a kind of a frozen borders of Central Asia. China and the Soviet Union, they didn't have much interaction across these borders. They had border disputes. But after the breakup of the Soviet Union, a totally new geopolitics has emerged. In fact, I would say that the post-Cold War geopolitics centered around Central Asia because the defining feature was the breakup of the Soviet Union. And in geopolitical terms, the independence of the Central Asian republics was the key factor, because it meant that the hitherto frozen boundaries opened, and now you see there roads, rails, pipelines, etc., which are crisscrossing. And this has created a totally new dynamic. India started off with a good background of a legacy of friendship and warmth from Soviet times. And there's been no legacy of conflict or bitterness. Which is why when these countries became independent, they looked to India primarily as a country with which they wanted to develop good relations. But that could not develop because India, while having so many connections with Central Asia, does not have physical connectivity with Central Asia, and that is because Pakistan comes in between, and Pakistan, as you know, has always had a policy of denying India any access to Afghanistan and to the Central Asian space beyond. That's has been a constant policy. Not that Pakistan has benefited greatly, but India has not benefited certainly. And this has meant that the Central Asian politics have been dominated by China and Russia and some American interventions and so forth, which is a bit reduced now. And, uh, and therefore, the Indian connection to Central Asia is much weaker than the circumstances, objective circumstances, would warrant. Uh, it's become difficult for India to compete with other countries in Central Asia, say on the economic front, on the trade front. It may be a 2-hour flight from Delhi to Tashkent or Dushanbe or whatever, but the surface route is very long, and it has been very difficult to compete with the Chinese, the Turkish, the Russian, uh, which have the geographical contiguity. Uh, we've made investments in this region because, specifically in the oil and gas sector, but this has also been a hurdle for many years because earlier the Central Asians relied a lot on the Americans, so the Americans got a lot of of the of the holdings of oil and gas. Then the Chinese stepped it, and they used a lot of underhand methods to bribe and cajole the countries of the region. I remember we were looking for investments in Kurmangazi and the Petro-Kazakhstan oil fields. And over a weekend, the Chinese president rings up the president of Kazakhstan and offers him $500 million more and unspecified amounts under the table. So anyway, this is the problem which has been there. But India has persisted with its presence in the oil and gas sector. We have some holdings there. Cooperation is growing, and the Central Asian countries are also looking at at diversification of their dependence on China and Russia. So we have talk of the TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India gas pipeline. There is a new connectivity through the international north-south transit corridor via Iran to Russia. There is Chabahar, which is being developed, and that could connect with northern Afghanistan via Herat and Mazar-e-Sharif to Central Asia, as well as via Mashhad to Turkmenistan. And there's also railway lines being considered from Chabahar to Zahedan and on to Mashhad. But these are projects that are still underway. And obviously, they cannot be as efficient as if there was a direct line from India to Central Asia via Pakistan and Afghanistan. But since since Pakistan is not likely to change its attitude in the near future, India has had to rely on working via Iran. Now, here I just want to flag the criticality of Afghanistan for any Indian policy towards Central Asia. Because unless Afghanistan is stable, unless Afghanistan provides some viable transit route, it is impossible to access Central Asia. And therefore, what India is doing in Afghanistan is a sine qua non for an India-Central Asia policy. The second thing which is extremely important is Iran. And here, because as of now, other than this air corridor we have recently developed with Afghanistan, the only access that India has to Central Asia is via Iran. And here we run into a problem because you have the American sanctions on Iran, which President Trump is threatening to reimpose, and the geopolitics of the region, where Iran is definitely on the wrong side as far as Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the United States are concerned. Your next talk, you will talk a little more about that, so I won't go into that detail. So this becomes a little bit of a quandary and a problem for India. Let me talk a little bit about Tibet and Xinjiang, which I have put in the Central Asian mold. They are today formally a part of the Chinese People's Republic, but they were not so. And as far as India is concerned, the security threats from China to India arise not so much because China is a global power or that it is a dominant power in Asia, but because it is a neighbor of India, and that proximity to India is in Tibet and Xinjiang. So what happens in Tibet and Xinjiang is of vital importance to India from a security point of view. I don't know how things will develop there. Certainly these two provinces are part of China today. But it means that India has to keep a very close tab on what is happening in Tibet and Xinjiang. And if you, I'm sure you've studied the history of this region in the early 20th century, the Curzonian doctrine of wanting a presence there, and certainly to keep Tibet and Xinjiang as buffer states. I mean, India had a presence in Lhasa, in Kashgar, in Yarkand, there were trading routes and so forth. So all that was indicative of the importance, the geostrategic importance that this region has for India. And you see it most dramatically today in the fact that the China-Pakistan economic corridor goes from Xinjiang via Gilgit-Baltistan, Pakistan-occupied Kashmir to Pakistan. So without this physical contiguity, there is no China-Pakistan link. It has been illegally occupied, as you know, but that is the reality on the ground. And that is why India has to be very careful in what is to see what is happening in this region and to try and shape developments in a direction that we want. Tibet, in my view, is a key factor in India-China relations. I think that the dispute with China in the 50s leading to the border war in 1962 arose primarily over the question of Tibet. And if you look at the records of 1956 visit of Zhou Enlai to India, he came on the heels of the Dalai Lama, who had come for the 2500th anniversary of the birth of Lord Buddha. So Zhou Enlai followed him, and all his conversations with Nehru at that time focused on Tibet, because the Chinese understood that the Indian attitude on Tibet was critical. The Dalai Lama wanted asylum in India. Nehru sent him back and said, look, you have to fight your own battles. In 1959, when the Dalai Lama fled to India, took refuge in India, the Chinese were very worried. And that explains why in 1960, Zhou Enlai tried to get a settlement with India on the border. I won't go into what happened and so forth, that I think the speaker on China may do it. But the point is that the Tibetan factor is extremely important. And as you can see over the last decade or so, ever since the 2008 problems in Tibet, Tibet has become a very, very important factor. The Chinese claim on Arunachal Pradesh arises out of the fact that supposedly Tawang has got Tibetan culture. So that is one. Xinjiang, I've already mentioned that without the Chinese control of Xinjiang, there is no China-Pakistan economic corridor. Now, given this background, where are we developing our relations with Central Asia? I think there's a clear focus on terrorism, security cooperation. We are members of the regional organizations like the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and SICA, the Conference on Interaction and Confidence Building in Asia. We are trying to work out some kind of an FTA, if possible, with the Eurasian Economic Union. There is progress in IT and pharmaceuticals. There's energy cooperation. I mentioned about oil and gas, but then there is also uranium, which we are getting from them after we got after the Indo-US nuclear deal and the NSG gave the exemption a few years ago. Certainly there is better air connectivity now between India and Central Asia, though it's not at all adequate. Certainly it's much better than the time that I was in Central Asia. I was ambassador to Kazakhstan from 95 to 99, and it used to be a nightmare to get from Delhi to any of these places. But now there are flights, and I think that Central Asia is also being used as a means to access the Siberian Far East and Siberia and the Far East. One thing which I think we all need to be alert to is the impact of developments in Central Asia, the Soviet Central Asia, the 5 Central Asian republics, on Xinjiang. Because that is an artificial border between the two. I mean, historically, what is now Xinjiang was called East Turkestan, and what is the Central Asian republics was Turkestan. And it's a border which runs roughly in a north-south direction, whereas the rivers and others are in an east-west direction. There's common ethnicities, Kazakhs, Uyghurs on both sides. And if Central Asia were to, Soviet Central Asia were to be destabilized in any way, and the institutional structures in Central Asia are not very strong, even 25 odd years after independence, and that would have definitely an impact on Xinjiang. And that is why the Chinese are so paranoid about Xinjiang and the so-called separatist and terrorist activity there. And they're continually expanding this sphere of influence. First, they took over Xinjiang, then they've taken over economically anyway the Central Asian republics. Now they want to go ahead further into Afghanistan. It's all to try and build a buffer. But they're running into dangerous territory because now they're coming up against jihadi elements in Afghanistan and so forth. They're trying to cut a deal with them. I don't know how far all this will succeed. The short point I'm trying to make is that China cannot insulate itself from what is happening in Soviet Central Asia, and therefore it is trying to control developments in this region. Let me now turn briefly to some of the Gulf region. I think Arun, who's sitting here, will be talking on Iran, Palestine and Israel, so I will not touch on that. But let me speak briefly about the Gulf region. We have a few minutes. How much time should we leave for questions? 10 minutes? Yeah, okay. So I'll speak for another 5 or 10 minutes and then we'll there. The Gulf, as you know, has had also very close historical linkages to India, both trade and culture. And the Gulf states were really controlled from India. The Indian rupee used to be legal currency there till the mid-19th century or so, even later. And you had a lot of these sheikhs and other rulers who who lived off India. They, even today, there are lots of properties which they own in Bombay. There's been an exchange of population between, say, Hyderabad and Oman and Yemen and so forth. And of course, there was the connection of Islam, because the Mecca and Medina are in Saudi Arabia. Well, today India gets 2/3 of its oil, roughly, from this region, and there are more than 8 million Indian citizens living and working there. There is, as I mentioned, the Hajj factor. So all this adds to a lot of interdependence. Not just that India is dependent on them. I mean, the UAE is, I think, the largest trading partner just in terms of goods, or maybe the second, I'm not sure. Because Dubai is a place which services the whole region. And this region itself survives because of the presence of this large community of 8 million or so Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis and Nepalis and Sri Lankans. And without this South Asian community, the Gulf would collapse. The infrastructure in the Gulf, the service infrastructure would just collapse. All these buildings which are coming up, these are built primarily by people from this region. But since this is an area where India has such enormous interests, we are of late taking greater interest in issues related to defense and security, cooperation on countering terrorism. And here I would like to flag the importance of a few of the countries, the larger countries, the UAE in the first instance, which I understand Prime Minister Modi is going to visit next month. And over the last few years, we've seen that there's been an annual exchange of visits. UAE was the first country that Prime Minister Modi visited, then the Crown Prince came, then he was again here as a chief guest of Republic Day a year ago, and now Prime Minister is going there. Because there is so much that binds India and UAE, that, and the UAE is also looking for greater interaction with India. I think they also understand that as the country which has huge stakes, both people-wise and trade and otherwise, in the region, that we would be concerned if there is instability in the Gulf. And India has to have policies which ensure stability there, because if the Gulf were to blow up, there's a war or something, it would be an impossible situation for India with 8 million Indians there. It would create a domestic political crisis. So India has to be very active and alert in this region. There's Saudi Arabia, again, very important because and also, I should mention that both from UAE and Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states, we're looking for investments because they've got a lot of investable surpluses. And as India wants to develop its infrastructure and economy, we're looking for sources from all over the world so that there is not too much dependence on one side. So there's Saudi Arabia, again, the Islamic factor, the fact that there are 170, 80 million Muslims here, and so many go on Hajj, on Umrah. All this creates dependencies, mutual dependencies. Iraq used to be a rather important partner of India, but then after the Iraq war, the level has declined, though Iraq has now come up again as one of the top suppliers of oil to India. And the other country I would like to flag is Oman, a country which the Prime Minister is supposed to be visiting next month also, because that controls, that's the country nearest to India. There's been a traditional friendship. It's totally unlike the other Gulf countries. And it is also the access to the Gulf through the Straits of Hormuz is controlled by Oman and by Iran. And there's the whole seaboard there. So India, I think from a security perspective, has to look at Oman a little more carefully. The problem in this region is that over the last 7, 8 years, ever since I suppose the Arab Spring, the divisions, the rivalries, and the contradictions have come to the fore, and there is no one major power which is dominant, and everyone fancies itself as a rather important player. And I would flag the following as the key players who are jostling for geostrategic space and, if possible, domination. Well, there's Egypt, which has traditionally been the leader of the Arab world, but now is not playing that role after the convulsions 2011 onwards. But still, it is the most populous country in the region with a great tradition, sophisticated, well-educated population, cannot ever be ignored. There's Israel, which we all know has many capabilities and strengths. Arun will talk about that in greater detail. There's Turkey, which was the seat of the Ottoman Empire. There's Saudi Arabia, which fancies itself as the leader of the Muslim world thanks to its control of the two holy shrines of Makkah and Medina. Iraq was an important player till it was knocked out by the Americans. But now Iraq and Syria have become the kind of a space which threatens the whole region, because they abut countries, all the countries of the region, and therefore this instability in Syria and Iraq is very deleterious for the region. And finally, there is Iran, which has always been a regional player and which holds the key to stability in the region, but which has been prevented from playing its legitimate role in the region for reasons that are well known. And now you have these intra-Gulf rivalries, the anti-Qatar coalition, which Saudi Arabia and Iran and UAE have cooked up. So, so the Gulf Cooperation Council is becoming much weaker. The other problem potential is, this Kurdish aspirations, which affect Turkey, Iraq, Iran, Syria, and nobody wants that the Kurds should be an independent state, but they have their aspirations, and this is always going to be a little problematic. And one of the problems is that one of the contradictions is that on the one hand, now you see the Americans are putting a lot of pressure on Pakistan and at the same time on Iran. But if you put pressure on Pakistan, how do you access Afghanistan without the cooperation of Iran, particularly when you're on bad terms with Russia also? So I don't know how these contradictions are going to be resolved to ensure that there's a stable Afghanistan. The other question mark over the region is, of course, the 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 declining role. It may take a few decades, but the declining role of oil. What with newer forms of energy coming, solar and the shale oil and gas. So if the world does not need this region's oil as much as it has over the last few decades, then the geopolitics will greatly change. So there is this inherent instability in the region, and it's a very troublesome region as far as India is concerned, full of troubles and uncertainties. But a region from which India cannot walk away because it's too close to us, and we have too many long-term interests in the region, and therefore the Indian policy has to be to see how we can maintain our interest in the region and weave our way through the contradictions which involve the rivalries among the major powers. I think we are doing it reasonably well because we have good relations with Israel, exemplified by Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit and Prime Minister Modi's visit there last year. We with the Arab countries, with the UAE and Saudi Arabia and Oman in recent times, and with Iran. But it's not going to be easy, and I think that Indian diplomacy has its task cut out.